So this is the first major exhibition ever held in the United States on the art of Bali. There have been small shows in galleries which have covered mostly modern and contemporary painting and sculpture, so works that were made over the past 70 years, mostly for the art market, but this show is very different from that. Its main focus is on art that was made for the Balinese, primarily for uses in ritual performance or in court culture. The objects, there are 131 objects, and they're primarily drawn from two Dutch collections, from the Tropenmuseum in Amsterdam and from the Ethnology Museum in Leiden. The Netherlands were a colonial presence in Indonesia for over 300 years, and so it makes sense that, hey, they have such rich collections from that region. There are also some lenders from the United States and some private lenders as well. People may ask if we borrowed from Bali. None of the objects come from institutions in Bali mostly because of financial considerations when we were putting the show together. So just a little introduction to the show as a whole. It's kind of divided thematically into three major factors which have had an impact on the artistic culture of Bali. The first room, the room that we're in here, talks about geography. And it talks about some of the beliefs and belief systems that were present before the coming of Indic ideas. When you move into the next gallery, we talk about the influx of new ideas, so ideas about Buddhism and Hinduism and court culture that came from India, often through the neighboring island of Java, and not only about those ideas and how they were adapted, but also about the continuation of indigenous ideas and the adaptation and integration of the two. When we move into Osher, it continues with court culture a bit and talking about the courts as patrons of the arts. And then the final, very last bit of the gallery talks about the first sort of major influx of Americans and Europeans in Bali, which was mostly in the 1920s and 1930s, and sort of looks at some of the objects that were collected by some of these early visitors and some of the impressions that Bali made on these people. So starting with geography in this gallery. Here we see Bali, one of over 17,000 islands that make up the vast archipelago of Indonesia. Many of our visitors probably won't know that Bali is not an independent country. It'd be nice if you guys, situated it within the nation of Indonesia. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. And what makes Bali so unique is that just this little tiny region remains very much Hindu. At one point 1,000 years ago, much of Southeast Asia had evidence of Hindu practices. But today, Bali is really the only place in this vast region where these traditions remain strong. And it's a very fascinating culture because of that. And we're going to talk a bit about that, a lot about that as we go around. Here's a map of the island itself. You can see that it's bisected from east to west with this chain of volcanoes. And this geography has really shaped the island in many ways. Volcanic eruptions have laid down layer after layer of rich, fertile soil, especially in the south here, and have enabled the Balinese to cultivate wet rice farming for thousands of years. We have evidence from inscriptions from 1,000 years ago talking about the boring of channels throughout the landscape in order to form the kind of terraces you see in the photo on the back wall there. And this mode of agriculture has enabled them to have very fertile harvests, which has also given them time and money to spend on pursuits like the making of art. The mountains are also important because it's the direction people orient themselves to. The most sacred mountain is Mount Agung here. The mountains are thought to be the homes of the gods. any temple or is faced toward the mountain, people talk about going toward the mountain or away from the mountain. Even if you live in the north, the direction toward the mountain is this way. So the same word, kaja, is used going north if you're up here, but going south if it's there. So you orient yourself toward the center, toward the mountains in the middle. They're very important. So this gallery here talks about the rice goddess and the importance of agricultural deities in Bali from the beginnings of rice cultivation in this area. And we see lots of different implements. In the case behind you are some agricultural tools that were used to harvest rice itself. There's been a change in agriculture lately. The type of rice since the 1960s was really changed, but the old style of Bali rice was very tall rice, and it would be harvested in the fields with little knives like this. And the one on the left is missing its stick. It would have had a stick like this going through it. And people talk that the way these knives were formed were so that the farmer could hold them in their hand with the stick here, and they could harvest the rice without the rice deity in the rice being afraid of this happening. Behind are these rice paddles, which with this old type of rice, they'd be gathered into these big sheaves. There's a photograph showing women carrying some of these sheaves on their head, and these would be used to sort of even out the ends before the rice was gathered and then taken to be stored in the rice barns. The one on the left shows a demonic figure. It's often described as being Boma, who is a deity which was adapted from India, but probably in this case had some indigenous roots as well, who is in myth said to be the child of the earth goddess and Vishnu. And so it makes it a good image to be put on this agricultural tool. Over here we have some images of the rice goddess herself. In Bali, she's called Dewi Shri, which comes from the Sanskrit Shri Devi, but it's very likely that this was just a name that was put upon a much older agricultural deity that was worshipped in Bali before the influx of these ideas from India. We find rice goddesses throughout the Indonesian archipelago, which are given various different names. So obviously this was a deity that was very important very early on. These are very interesting images. They're made presumably by a woman, made to be ephemeral. They're made out of a type of lontar palm leaf that is very carefully plaited together. They would have been placed in the family shrine of a family of farmers, or sometimes maybe in a shrine out in the rice fields themselves. They have a very distinctive form of this narrow waist and then this headdress which really flares out. And people describe this shape coming from those very bundles of rice that you saw, you can see in the picture there, which are gathered together, then flare up at the top. At first they look very simple, but if you come and look close up at them, they're incredibly intricately made. Other places you see the rice goddess Dewi Shri are on these tall offering decorations, which would have been placed on altars in different contexts in Bali. Two very different forms, this one very geometric, and this one taking more the shape of a shadow puppet, more naturalistic than the one on your left. This type of long hanging is called a lamak, and it's most commonly made in Bali out of palm leaf. But in some regions of Bali, the women have taken to making them in other more permanent materials. The one on the left is very rare. It's one that's made out of felt, and this one on the right is an embroidered version. Deity comes in are in these images of that are made out of Chinese coins, which is a really interesting form, and it's interesting how this material, this Chinese coins, have become an important part of Balinese offerings of many different types, different kinds of hangings, things used in funerary ceremonies. Often coins are part of offerings. In this case, it's a couple, Dewi Shri on one side and her husband, who is known as Rambut Sadhana. And I'm going to make up a list of these terms and their pronunciation and ask someone to post them for you. And he's the god of material wealth. And often temples in Bali will have shrines to both these deities side by side in a temple complex. Another belief that predates the coming of Hindu ideas is the belief in ancestors. And in Bali, ancestors are venerated as gods. We know that from some of the earliest archaeological sites in Bali, we have the presence of bronze and ceramic grave goods in graves, and also very early stone sarcophagi, all sort of indicating a belief in the afterlife and a belief in the importance of burial customs to bring important goods with the deceased on to the next life. From our own collection, upstairs are these two bronze ancestral figures. There's not very many of these in the world, and we don't know very much about them. On the right is one that comes from the Museum of Ethnology in Leiden. We assume that they probably are related to ancestral deities because they very much resemble images that were made in stone that are still found in some temples in Bali today. And the images made in stone are luckily inscribed with the names. Some of them are inscribed with the names of rulers, so that we know that they were made to commemorate specific royal individuals. Involved in the other wooden sculptures in this gallery, the presence of having paired images of male and female figures seems to be very important and is associated both with agricultural deities and ancestral deities. This pair, I'm not quite sure which one they are. They have that same sort of very frontal appearance that you see in the bronze statues, but the female figure, the one on the left here, seems to be carrying a sheaf of something, perhaps rice, so she could be associated as well with the rice goddess. Ancestors or geography, but with indigenous ideas in Bali, and these have to do with ideas that spread from East Java to Bali. This is a very important local Indonesian story about Prince Panji and his beloved, his unrequited love, Princess Rangkasari, which you'll see other versions of throughout the exhibition. And this is a very unusual pair of sculptures. I've never seen a pair like this before and was a little bit baffled by it, but someone who knew the story well told me about an episode of the story where in Bali most books are written on lontar, which is sort of a palm leaf and scratched in, and then you put charcoal. But for love notes, sometimes people would take the petals of also a type of palm, and they would scratch the love notes onto the petal of the palm. And there's an episode in the Panji story where he thinks his beloved is married to his best friend, and he's bummed out, and he's wandering in the forest, and he picks a petal and he writes a love note to her. So I think that this is perhaps showing that episode of the story. Okay, why aren't there more bronze materials? Well, what's really interesting specifically about Bali is that there seems to have been a period about 400 years ago or so when people really moved from using permanent materials like stone or bronze to using more ephemeral materials for making images. And so that tradition of making bronze images, or even making, major stone images of deities, died out. And the reasons why are really interesting, but it's a real transition you see. And so I think bronze was still, or metals were still used to make weapons, to make instruments, but they weren't used to make figures of deities anymore. So this is the oldest object in the exhibition, and it talks about It's perhaps up to 2,000 years old. The next gallery talks about the influx of ideas from India, but this sort of attests to the idea that there was trade of ideas and objects from 2,000 years ago, and drums of this type were made in northern Vietnam, and you find bronze cultural objects that have connections to northern Vietnam throughout much of Southeast Asia and into the Indonesian archipelago. In Bali, you have some, in Indonesia, you have some drums which seem to be specific to the islands. So you don't find the same iconography on drums from northern Vietnam, even though the technique and some of the basic shape is the same. And we have evidence that drums like this, because we found molds, were made in northern Bali itself. Whether this one was made in Bali or in Java, we don't know. We do know that the largest bronze drum ever found anywhere in Southeast Asia is in Bali, and it's currently, there's a picture of it there, it's currently in a temple in southern Bali. So this is just sort of speaking to the very early exchange of ideas and art objects. Talk about how different these two images are. They have a different palette. They're using, very specific depictions of textiles, and the question was, do you think that this is the influence of tourism? And this is a question that really puzzled me, because the stories that these are characters from were not widely known in the West. They weren't like the Indian epics. So in some ways, I can't imagine a Westerner particularly wanting them. I think that they probably were made for a local audience. This type of story was a favorite among the courts, and it might be somewhat of a Western influence in it's a type of image that was made. I don't know if it had this piece had any specific religious purpose other than to illustrate a famous narrative, but I don't think it was made for a Western person.
So just briefly about the North Court, we worked with a local Balinese artist. His name is Imade Moja. So the letter I, Made, M-A-D-E. Most people just call him Moja, M-O-J-A. So he's lives in Berkeley. He used to run a store in Berkeley called Dessa Arts, which recently just closed, unfortunately. But he's from a family of painters, so he's actually a traditional Balinese artist, painter, but he also dances with Gamelan Sekar-Jaya and other dance companies in the Bay Area. So you'll be able to see him perform in March. He's doing they're doing a performance called Creatures of Balinese Mythology with Gamelan Sekar-Jaya, and he will be dancing in that. Does anybody have that program brochure? So, and all the programs are listed in here, and this is something that I really hope that when you're doing your tour, just refresh your memory what's coming up and just plug whatever you can, because, I mean, the programming is unprecedented. We've never done this many programs for a special exhibition before. So what we wanted to do here was really give you a sense of Bali, a kind of atmospheric, immersive experience of what it might be like, sort of. I mean, of course, you can only go so far here, inside of our museum. The idea was a village having its annual temple ceremony, perhaps, and the streets of the village, as you're approaching the temple, would be lined by this kind of offering, which is called a penjor. They're bamboo poles, and then on the bamboo poles are all these offerings that are hanging off. So these are also considered offerings. They're not just decorative necessarily. They're a specific kind of offering. Kind of funny behind-the-scenes story about these is, they are organic materials. We had them shipped in the container with all of the special things for the store. So we got this big container, across the sea, and so they were a little more tired looking than, but you don't have to go into that. But when you see photographs of them in the Bali, they're not looking quite so crunchy, they flow, but it really gives you an idea of what that might look like. the other element that we wanted to, so this was all designed by Moja. Okay, so this installation, he came up with this idea and really was thinking about, what are the cardinal directions? He's from, Natasha, where'd you go? What village is he from? He's from Batuan, which is in central Bali? Or southern Bali. So for him, did you cover Kalat and Kajod yet? Yeah. Did you cover Kajod and
about directions.
Yeah. So this was really interesting to me because, this sense of direction depends on where you are vis-a-vis the mountains and the sea, right? But so for central southern Balinese, the mountains are in general kind of in the north and the sea is kind of in the south. So therefore, the kind of more sacred corner of this space would be the northeast, our northeast. But if he was a North Balinese, it might be opposite, right? Is that correct? So anyway, he took that into consideration when he was laying this floor plan out. So the altar is a sort of temporary seat for the gods. It's not, think of it more of as a prop. If someone really pushes you on it, is this a real altar? Is it being? We're not equipped to do offerings that really should be happening every day. So it's really there to show you a sense of what it might look like, but this is not necessarily considered activated. But if someone wants to activate it, that's fine. They can temporarily activate it. So if that issue comes up, I just wanted to make that clear. And then these colorful banners as well are also part of what you would find at a, kind of in a time of celebration.
And what are they called? How do you pronounce them?
Those are umbo umbo, right, Natasha? Umbo umbo, yeah, yeah. Yes?
Is there any significance to the colors?
Probably the colors. This is more Natasha, what the symbolism of the colors is. And maybe I can answer whatever questions I can and then I'll pass the mic to her. So we'll come back to that. Because they can't.
There's a very complex system of different colors being associated with specific deities, but I don't think that's at all in play here. The one textile that you see that does have a lot of significance is this black and white checked, which is called polong, and which in Bali you often see wrapped around a temple or a sacred statue. It's really sort of a marker of something which is powerfully spiritual in some way.
And then just on the media elements in this space, most of the time you'll find this introductory video here. This is a 10-minute long video. It does have sound. We're still working out the bugs on the technology. So, but it's also open captioned. So all of the narration is there in text as well, but there's wonderful music that you're not getting. And it really just sort of gives you a broad introduction to the main themes. The other media elements in the North Court is down there against the wall. There's a computer kiosk there, and that is called the Bali Temple Explorer. And we worked with a London-based film artist who went to Bali and basically did in high-definition video this wonderful interactive site. So what you actually have to go, you can't just stand back and watch it. You have to get down, sit down, and use the mouse and click on to navigate around this temple complex, which he filmed during a celebration, a ceremony. So you'll see people in worship, you can see some of the gamelan, you can see an offering being made. So you have to spend some time to really get deep in and explore it, but it's meant to be this kind of immersive experience, of Bali as best we can do through technology. And then there's other media elements in the exhibits, which I talked about in the training, but there's a slideshow in the first gallery. We decided to take audio out of that first gallery because it's a small space, and we thought it would be challenging for all of the tours, and there's going to be audio in the other gallery, so we thought let's have one gallery where there's not audio to contend with. So there's two media elements in the Hambrecht gallery that you'll see. One you'll see, one is still not working yet, we're getting there, and then two in the Osher gallery. And then the audio tour has 6 video clips on the 20 stops of that. There's only 6 that actually have a video clip. So the rest of it is just audio, just as a reminder. And you should have that list of audio stops. And then I think I'll pass it over to Natasha to talk about the in the flow, right? So the one art object that's part of the exhibit is down there, and we'll talk about that, I think, between Hambrecht and Osher.
Rangda, who is a really good example of this combination of indigenous ideas meeting Hindu ones. The name Rangda itself means widow. She's described in many ways. A lot of tourists who first come to Bali encounter her in a performance where Rangda faces off against another character, and we see masks of both back here, a animal protective spirit called Barong. So that's one common way, and in this encounter it's often sort of described as this battle between good and evil. But she's much more complex than that. Some of her origins are thought, the widow part come from an ancient Javanese story where she was the widow of a king, and because her daughter was slighted, she causes pestilence and death throughout the land. She's also, and here we have the integration of Indian ideas, conceived of as both a form of Durga, the Hindu goddess Durga, and a student of Durga. And so it's an interesting combination. The Barong, which she fights with in these dance dramas. Here you see a statue, a archival photograph of a dancer as Rangda, and also a mask of Rangda over here, and an archival photograph of Barong and a mask over here. There are other forms. Barongs are sort of protective animal spirits, and the most commonly known is this type. But there are also other kinds, which you see across the gallery, which take the form of other animals, including a tiger, a boar, and a lion here. And in the video on the screen here, you see, here it is in the temple itself, a boar, barong, and if you watch a little bit later in the video, you see it being danced in performance. And they're really wonderful. If you look behind these, you see the masks are actually not placed on the face, but held in front of them by these poles which stick out the back. And then the dancers are able to just make the face move and the jaws snap, and they're just very, very skilled at bringing these guardian creatures to life. They sort of take temporary residence in a number of different types of images. One thing that they can come down and do is take residence on an animal mount. They have different types of animals, often these they're empty boxes which are carved in the shapes of different composite mythical animals. This one is a winged lion. The one in the back has the head of a crowned naga or snake, wings of some avian creature, and the tail of a fish. And sometimes there's actually small wooden images in which the gods are thought to descend into, but sometimes it's just thought that they have come and they are spiritually present in the temple itself. Sometimes figures made out of plant matter and flowers are made, and that's what the deities are said to descend into. The beautiful palanquin behind you, during these festivals when the gods descend, sometimes they're paraded about from one temple to another. Sometimes gods are thought to have relative gods in another temple, and when they come to visit, they want to go see their relatives. And so the whole congregation of the temple will go in procession and take the deities from one temple to another. And you see that using these types of palanquins you see here. A culture in which what you do, your daily activities, your daily work for the temple is more important than any one specific text or, epic or book. And that's really true for most people in Bali. Their life is filled with daily offerings, with making special, participating in temple events in one way or other by making food or making decorations or dancing or being a puppet master or building structures But there is a section of people, the priests of Bali, who are very well versed in Sanskrit texts, in the epics. And one of the most important things that the high priests do is the preparation of holy water. Water is very important in every Balinese ceremony. The use of water is vital. It's part of most offerings. When you go to temple and you pray, you get the priest will bless you with holy water. You'll see images of this in the slideshow in the first gallery. And so one of the primary things that high priests do is preparing holy water to be used by the congregation, etc. So some of the ways in which the Hindu epics were incorporated into Balinese painting. All three of these works are court works, which were taken by the Dutch during the final conquest of southern Bali. And they show different episodes. This one here is an episode from the Ramayana. These are kind of hard to read unless you take your time and study, and they have numerous episodes on the same panel. Down here you see Ram with his bow and arrow, his brother Lakshman below him, Hanuman, the white-faced monkey, back behind them, and Lakshman is shooting an arrow, and he is fighting Indrajit, who's Ravana's son, down here. Up above, in another scene, you see the same characters again. This time, Lakshman, who is shooting down here, has been shot himself up above, and he eventually gets rescued. But meantime, over here, we see Ram again, who is shooting at Ravana, and you see the severed heads, Ravana's 10 heads. I don't think they show them all here, but you see numerous of his severed heads being splayed about behind him. And the final scene from the end of the epic is the test of Sita, where rumors go about that she has not been faithful, and she steps into the fire and is saved by the fire god Agni, who proves that she has been faithful all along and saves her from the flames. This one is from the Mahabharata, and features Garuda, who is a great favorite throughout Southeast Asia. This comes from an episode where Garuda's mother has been made a slave by her sister and is being forced to take care of her sister's 100 evil little serpent children. And so Garuda is trying to save his mother. The way to do so is to go and steal the elixir of immortality from the gods, because this will set his mother free. And so you see him here in one hand holding the elixir, and the gods all around fighting him. And after this is done is when Vishnu, at the end of this episode, Vishnu asks him to become his mount, and this is when you start having this combination of Vishnu riding Garuda from this story. A couple in two places in the galleries. It's the story of the god of love, Shiva and the god of love. And like many stories in Indonesia in this format, they don't tell you the whole story. They just drop you right in the middle. It's assumed that you will be able to tell by looking what's going on. You're familiar enough with the story. So what's happening before this is that there's been a demon ravaging heaven, and no one can do anything about it, and they want to ask Shiva to help, but he is deep in meditation. He's not helping. So they ask Kama, the god of love, to go and wake Shiva up so that Shiva and his wife will create a child who might be able to solve the problem. And so we come in here after the main event has happened, the god of love has gone, he's tried, Shiva has woken up, enraged, and burned the god of love to smithereens, to ashes. And so now they have to go tell the wife. And so here we are with this entourage going to tell Rati, who is the wife, and she is inconsolate. She hangs on the messenger's leg. Here we see her palace, and she sets off again with her handmaidens to go to the cremation grounds, where in the ashes she finds the skull and some of the bones of her husband. Shiva then wakes, and he brings the flame back up, and Rati and her handmaidens jump in the fire and are burned to death. And this is not, the story has a happier ending. Shiva then has a baby with his wife, and the baby deals with the enemy, and he brings both the god of love and his wife back to life again. So what's interesting also about this is that it comes from the pavilion of a bed of a royal chamber in southern Bali. And the practice of, when one's husband died, of jumping into the flames was something that was prevalent in Bali up until up until the late 1800s. And it was something that the Dutch were quite appalled by and tried to put an end to. And so it's interesting that this theme, whether it be a theme of devotion or whatever, was used in a bedchamber of a royal palace is an interesting concept. Most of the works behind you have to do with cremation. All major milestones in the life of a Balinese are commemorated in some way or other. There's a commemoration of the first time a child's feet touches the ground, their first haircut, but none are quite as spectacular as cremation. And this has its roots in ancestor worship and the need to cut the ties between this world and let the soul of the deceased travel on to the world of the ancestors and become an ancestral deity. So there's several things in this gallery having to do with that. This one photograph, this one painting, a modern painting, shows many of the stages in that process. This really interesting bark cloth drawing would have been sort of a sampler for similar types of cloth that were laid on top of the body of someone before they were cremated. And then we have in the next room 2 videos which were done by 2 independent artists, one talking about royal cremation and the other talking about village cremation of 2 individuals. Called a gringsing. It's an interesting cloth for a number of reasons. It's made with a very complicated technique called double ikat, in which both the threads of the weft and of the warp are dyed with the pattern before the whole thing is woven together. This is a technique which is only made in 3 places in the world: in Japan, in India, and in one isolated village in Bali. These textiles are considered very sacred. They're used for numerous purposes. At first, when you look at if you look at this from this, it looks like just this abstract pattern. But if you get back to about where you're standing, if you look carefully, you could see that there's a series of figures, seated figures, groups in each of these semicircles. They're sort of pointed out in this graphic here, but there's a turbaned man who's sitting cross-legged with a woman next to him, facing him with her arms like this, and another character in a sort of patterned sarong looking backwards behind them. And so it's a really interesting technique and a depiction probably of a priest and his wife. Women are most often, if a man is a priest, a woman is also a priestess who helps her husband, and after his death assumes the same rituals and rites, or performs the same rituals and rites that he does. And so it's a depiction of a woman and probably a priest and a priestess. People who make these types of textiles And this is something that I don't think most of you are really going to have to address very much in a tour, but there are different cultural groups in Bali. There's people who live in the highlands who are sometimes called the Bali Aga people, and they have different customs. Their villages are sometimes oriented in a different way than the people who live in the lowlands. So yes, this is a Bali Aga village. And what was the other thing you asked?
The DNA evidence
Oh,
that they're
you know,
related.
I don't know enough about that study to say, you know, one way or the other. There have been some archaeological studies which have found evidence of, you know, direct Indian trade to Bali, and I think a tooth was found somewhere that has DNA from India, but I don't think there's been enough study to, you know, definitely say one thing or the other. For deity, am I including ancestors? Yes, there's ancestral deities, there's Hindu deities, there's agricultural deities, there's animal tutelary sort of spirit deities. Okay, this pavilion comes from the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, and when I originally found it in old archival photographs, you can see one here. It's displayed with one of those effigies of an animal, a bull, in which a body would have been placed to be burned. And so I thought that would be really interesting to have, to talk about cremation rituals. And so we asked for the pavilion, and they said yes, but you have to it's painted and you have to protect the paint, so you have to put some guards for the light. And then they said, but you can't have the bull because that's got black velvet and it's textile and it's more light sensitive. And so we sat and we thought, what should we do? And we thought, well, maybe we would commission Balinese artists to make one for us. And so we talked to the Balinese community here and to some Balinese artists in Bali, and they were all very against the idea. And they said, you know, you don't make one of those unless you have someone to go in them. And so I thought that was very interesting and spoke to the living culture and nature of artistic production in Bali today, and is a good way to talk about this empty pavilion. But then just the other day I was walking past here with two Balinese, and the basic structure of this pavilion you can find in many different contexts in Bali. It is not discrete at all to cremation. You could find, and they both said, oh, that looks like the type of pavilion a king would have in his palace up on a hill to look over, you know, the village around him, which made me think, well, maybe the Dutch just saw a pavilion they liked and they, you know, commissioned it or took it and then they put a bull into it. So there's a bit of mystery. I don't have the documents which explain that, but when you talk about this, you can talk about it being the basic structural format of architecture in Bali, a four-post pavilion, which could be used in numerous contexts. This was how it was used in Holland in the 1930s, and you know, there's our tie. And here's what a pavilion in Bali, this one is made out of bamboo and cloth. The types of animal effigies can vary. We often see bulls, but the two photographs on the other side show you sort of the inventiveness of them. And I think they have some connection to those animal carrying boxes. You often find the same composite animal forms, some of which are connected, many of which are connected, these are connected to the caste or kin group of the individual. Sort of another new idea that came into Bali, which was the idea of court culture. And moving from societies in which a village would have a council, say a council of elders, to villages grouped together, ruled by a ruler who was thought to be not divine necessarily, but designated by the gods to rule in some way. So lots of the objects in here relate to court culture and the ways are objects that would have been in palaces or decorated them. I'm going to start with this tiny little image here, which when you have a chance, you should all come and look at it closely. It's really quite spectacular. And I like to contrast this with the first image we saw of the rice goddess made out of palm leaves. This is the handle for a kris, or sacred dagger. Krises were not only thought of as weapons, but very important heirlooms that could also be thought of to have their own active agency. There's many myths and stories in Bali about krises that do things on their own. But this one is is incredibly carved out of ivory. Presumably it would have been made, not by a woman out of things she found near her home, but out of a very rare and expensive material, ivory. We have texts talking, there's one report of a Thai trader coming to Bali, I forget when, I think in the 1800s, and he goes to visit a ruler in southern Bali, and the one thing the ruler requests is that when you come back, please bring me ivory. And the one thing, besides one object in the other gallery, this is the only thing that I've ever seen ivory being used for, is kris handles. This depicts a demonic figure. It's perhaps the god of wind, who is sometimes depicted on kris handles of this type, and really shows the height of art for court culture, probably by a very specific workshop associated with a court in southern Bali. Really before the 1850s, when the Dutch first visited Bali in 1597, but it was very brief, and they actually left Bali alone for the most part. Bali was a small island. It was difficult to navigate to. The harbors on both the north and south is treacherous coral reefs. It was so small, and even though it was fertile, it wasn't big enough to have major plantations. It was, because of the geography of the island, the volcanoes and the water flow down the mountains sort of rent these deep ravines, mostly moving north to south, which made these real geographic divisions. Even today, if you go from one region to the other, often you have to drive all the way down and back up because of the geography of the island. And that really isolated it. In the 16th century, there was sort of a centralized, very famous kingdom, but after that it really fragmented into these 8 or 9 separate kingdoms, which remain today the regencies. And before this period, Bali was known as a very fierce place. These areas were fighting each other often. It was known as a center of slavery. None of the sort of romantic notions that we have of Bali were really present until until the last 150 years. Then in about 1850, the Dutch decided that they wanted to consolidate their rule in Indonesia. They had been in Java and Sumatra for a long time, but Bali was one of the very last places that they had control of. And I think partially in competition, they saw the British go into Singapore, and they wanted to make sure no one else got this sort of central part of the archipelago. So beginning in 1850, they started and made a number of campaigns in the north, finally gained control of the northern kingdoms. And then in the early 20th century, they began their conquest against the south. And these were really sort of very dramatic events. The rulers of the kingdoms in the south knew that they couldn't defeat the Dutch. And so they gathered and they dressed themselves in ceremonial white, which is the color of purification and also the color bodies are wrapped in before cremation. And they just marched out into the gunfire of the Dutch troops in this act, which in Balinese is called a puputan, which means ending or fight to the finish. And those that weren't outright shot by the Dutch, there's reports of women throwing coins at soldiers and asking to be stabbed. It was this sort of mass, purposeful annihilation. And so this happened in 1906 in Badung in the south. It happened 2 more times. So the Dutch would move from kingdom to kingdom and face the same sort of, I can't imagine how, sort of what a vision it must have been. And then in 1908, the last of these kingdoms fell. This spectacular pair of doors, it's over 4 meters high, it's so tall we could not fit them upright in the galleries, comes from a palace in the southern kingdom at Denpasar. And there had been a Dutch artist who happened to be in the area when this happened, and he saw the conquest of the kingdom, and the rest of the palace was burned and demolished, and he saw soldiers who were going to use these doors as a bridge across a creek, and he rescued them and sent them back to Holland. So they're spectacular doors in themselves, but their collection history is also very interesting. In a lot of ways, palaces mimic temple architecture. They tend to be made of a number of courtyards, also with the doorway being very important. And you see similar images in both temples and in palace architecture or domestic architecture of doorways which have at the top, it's hard to see here, but there's birds at the very top. Often at the bottom you find water-related images, but here you have like a winged lion who's rearing its head. And in the central area, 2 winged figures, possibly Garuda or Jatayu. We don't know for sure who those 2 are. And the palanquin for the gods we saw in the other room, except this was made to carry a member of the royal family from somewhere in northern Bali. You see the same crowned naga on both. This one has a series of painted episodes depicting a story of Arjuna, who is shown in the back in meditation in a cave. And clearly, you were supposed to draw some connections between that seated image of the hero Arjuna on the back and presumably the person who is seated and being carried in the palanquin. Palanquins like this are still used today in ceremonial occasions. I don't know if you can see it in the video across the way, but in royal cremations today, members of the royal family are carried in procession on palanquins to this very day. Patrons of the arts. Palaces would have their own gamelons. This set of instruments is only part of a larger gamelan, a specific type of musical ensemble that was made to be, it's named after the god of love and was meant to be played outside the bedchamber of the king, either as he was sleeping or entertaining. It's a type of gamelan that you don't really find very much anymore, and known for its very sort of sweet music. Kings of certain palaces would have numbers of different gamelans for different occasions, some with up to 60 different instruments. Masked theater, in this area you see some implements used by legong dancers. Legong is one of the most famous dances known in the West. It was something that really fascinated the first Western visitors to Bali because it's danced by very, very young girls, prepubescent girls who are sort of swathed in these spectacular glittering costumes and textiles and move in time to the gamelan music, and is a really spectacular sight to see. The video over there shows you various types of Balinese dance in different contexts, giving you a sampling of some of the many different types of performing arts traditions. When the Dutch came in and took control of Bali, they initially took quite a bit of power away from many of the rulers, and a lot of patronage moved from from court to village. There had always been patronage at both places, but often the court would bring the most talented dancers to dance at the court. But here you started to see this transition to village organizations having their own gamelans and their own dancing troupes. The final section of the gallery we call Paradise Collected, and it's looking at the early 1920s and 1930s. After these sort of disastrous events in southern Bali, the Dutch really tried to remarket themselves and the island. And they said, one line was, we got rid of these terrible tyrants and now the villagers can be free to create and dance and make beautiful art. And they began to really promote Bali as this idyllic place. In this section we have examples of art either commissioned by, collected by, or made by 4 different Westerners. The first of which behind me is a series of statues made by or collected by a Dutch curator for the Tropenmuseum in Amsterdam. He was collecting them for the 1900 World Fair in Paris. And they're quite interesting in that they have no real counterpart in Bali. You do find deities of these statues of these deities, sometimes in stone, but these really large-scale wooden statues of Hindu deities was not something that you really found in Bali, but you do have evidence that he actually went to certain temples in North Bali where he saw similar images in stone, and he must have asked a Balinese artisan to recreate them for his purposes. On this wall here, we have a series of paintings by the Mexican artist and caricaturist Miguel Covarrubias. Covarrubias was quite well known in the 1920s and 1930s. He was the illustrator of dozens of covers for Vanity Fair and also illustrations for the New Yorker. He was part of a whole sort of community of early Europeans and Americans. If you look at the lists of people who traveled to Bali, Charlie Chaplin, all sorts of sort of people in the arts at that day all traveled to Bali. He traveled there and he spent a considerable amount of time there with his wife, Rose Covarrubias, who was a dancer and a photographer. And he wrote a book which is still one of the best ethnologies of Bali today, called Island of Bali. And you have from him both sort of romanticized images of dancers, etc., but he also took really deep care in recording different aspects of Balinese life. And we're including in this a series of illustrations he made of specific offerings where he names the type of offering, sometimes lists the sort of things that went into them. He also made images of different masked characters and of just really simple things like, which really show his power as a caricaturist in just simple lines depicting something which is instantly, you know it's Bali, from the position, the clothing, these big earplugs that I don't know if we talked about earlier that are common in a lot of Balinese women's illustrations. These 2 images come from our own collection. They were collected by a woman called Vicky Baum, who was an Austrian, and then she became an American citizen, an author. She was best known for writing the book upon which the movie Grand Hotel was made. And this shows this real movement away from traditional arts for use in ritual or performance to arts that were made for a tourist market. And it was in that time in vogue not to paint things, but to use smooth, unpainted, highly polished wood. And so this is showing a real transition in the types of art produced in Bali. And the final section of the exhibition has to do with Margaret Mead and shadow puppets. And probably some of you came to the lecture I gave on Margaret Mead a while ago. She collected over 300 puppets for the American Museum of Natural History. And a selection of them are on view here. She was really interesting, and unlike a lot of early tourists, she took careful note of where she collected an image, who the artist was, the costs of things, You know, she'll talk about the specific artist's skills and in making different types of puppets. So her collection is really interesting in that way. And then we end the exhibition with this painting that if you were at the lecture I gave earlier, I talk a little bit about, which is a painting that was commissioned by Margaret Mead's research assistant when she and her husband Gregory Bateson were about to depart the island and move on to New Guinea, where they were doing further research. And you see Bateson here. Well, first you see the Balinese volcano blurting out in smoke, goodbye, good luck. The volcano on New Guinea with the word welcome coming from its peak. And Gregory Bateson in the front of the boat waving at the villagers, while Margaret Mead, who is much smaller than Gregory Bateson, sits here tiny, waving back at the shores of Bali where all the villagers are weeping, especially her research assistant, who is shown in a Western-style shirt there, crying and waving goodbye.